Good day to everyone. Welcome back to the second day of our symposium on World Heritage in a Changing Climate. My name is Destry Jarvis. I am Vice President of UNESCO-ICOMOS, the United States National Committee for the International Council of Monuments and Sites, an NGO here in the USA that focuses on the World Heritage Program. I want to start by calling everyone's attention to an important report that UNESCO issued this week entitled World Heritage Forests, Carbon Sinks Under Pressure. It's available online. It's a good report. I've read it entirely. It points out that there are 257 World Heritage forests encompassing some 69 million hectares, 17 million acres plus or minus, but that 10, most of them are net carbon sinks. They store carbon dioxide in particular, but 10 of those forests, through various forces, have become net carbon emitters. And two of those 10 are here in the US, Yosemite National Park and Glacier National Park. In our case, due largely to the combination impacts of multiple fires and drought conditions. But it's also important to note that these natural areas inscribed on the World Heritage List are also significant cultural landscapes to the indigenous Native American tribes whose heritage encompasses those landscapes. And it's true all across the natural areas in the USA that are inscribed on the World Heritage List. We are pleased that everyone is here, back again for a second day. We hope you'll stick with us through the day. We're going to have some important presentations, several of them focused on the application of traditional ecological knowledge to making management decisions in the face of climate change in these World Heritage sites. But to begin, we are pleased and honored to have the Deputy Director of the World Heritage Center in Paris join us today, Jyoti Hosagrahar. And she comes to us as the leader within the World Heritage Center for implementation of the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation, the World Heritage Cities Program, the World Heritage and Sustainable Development Program, and the Earth and Architecture Program, as well as the Modern Heritage Program. She is a busy lady. Prior to joining UNESCO, she was a professor at Columbia University in New York City, and she holds her PhD in architecture and urbanism from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Hosagrahar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Destry, for that very warm introduction. And thank you to US-ICOMOS for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to join you and to be able to speak with you about the issues that are very much at the forefront of our world today. I'm going to switch to my presentation, if you will allow me for a second. So the climate change crisis, or the climate crisis, is the challenge of the century. Scientific reports, including those of UNESCO, one after the other, describe increasingly pessimistic scenarios of that all experts agree on, which is that we are in a race against time. A race to try to preserve our natural habitat in all of its beauty and diversity, to protect our ecosystems and natural resources, and to pass them on to future generations. A race to mitigate the destructive effects of climate change and find the most appropriate, innovative solutions. UNESCO is very actively mobilized to address the impacts of climate change on culture and to promote its role for climate action. Building on its interdisciplinary mandate on culture, science, and education, and based on its normative expertise, notably enshrined in its conventions and programs. As an illustration of this commitment, in the UNESCO draft medium-term strategy for 2022-2029 to be adopted by the General Conference next month. There will be strategic objectives dedicated to a number of different issues, very important among which are the expected outcomes related to enhancing knowledge for climate action, biodiversity, water and ocean management, and disaster risk reduction. In addition to enhancing the protection and promotion of the diversity of heritage. The result will make it possible to raise awareness of climate change's impact on the diversity of the world's natural and geological, cultural heritage. In this context, UNESCO will develop integrated actions with its unique global networks of designated sites and cities in order to experiment, enhance, and disseminate interdisciplinary approaches, local and indigenous knowledges, and good practices. In 2017, a new UNESCO strategy for action on climate change was adopted with the objective to enable member states to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts through education, science, culture, information, and communication in line with their respective national determined contributions, or NDCs, under the UNFCCC COP21 Paris Agreement, and in the overall context of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, SDG 13. The strategy must, in particular, support member states to develop and implement climate change education and public awareness programs and policies, promote interdisciplinary climate knowledge and scientific cooperation, draw on cultural heritage and cultural diversity to find appropriate responses to climate change, support inclusive social development, which takes into account gender inequality issues. On the strength of its experience in ethics and convinced that there is no common future without shared values, UNESCO took a further step forward in 2017 in adopting the Declaration of the Ethical Principles in relation to climate change, which focuses specifically on the need to approach this struggle from an ethical point of view. This declaration sets out a short list of the globally agreed ethical principles that should guide decision-making and policy-making at all levels and mobilize and help to address climate change. The declaration also advocates the 6 following principles of the prevention of harm: precautionary approach, equity and justice, sustainable development, solidarity and scientific knowledge, and integrity in decision-making. UNESCO has also always been present during the UNFCCC COP meetings, holding numerous side events to showcase UNESCO's climate action activities and engage with different stakeholders, putting its expertise at the service of member states, working in close synergy with the several in the overall UN system to enable bold and effective climate action. At the forthcoming COP26, for example, the UNESCO's Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems, or LINKS, which promotes local and indigenous knowledge and its inclusion in global climate science and policy processes, will be highlighted. Indeed, as you may all know, indigenous peoples are custodians of 80% of the world's biodiversity and are mobilizing their in-depth knowledge of the territories that they have been the source of their livelihoods for generations in order to address climate change. UNESCO also works with indigenous peoples to gather their irreplaceable knowledge of their environment. These peoples are very acutely aware of the effects of the ongoing climate disruption and perceive better than anyone else how nature reacts to change. Through its LINKS program, UNESCO combines indigenous knowledge with scientific research. This cooperation is most fruitful and increases our knowledge of climate phenomena. For example, African pastoralists can help meteorologists to improve their forecasts and provide local communities with more accurate and useful information. In February of 2020, UNESCO launched a reflection group on culture and climate change on the eve of the 52nd session of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, to explore and exchange on the role of culture as a key resource for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Following the reflection group, UNESCO established a co-sponsored initiative with the IPCC and ICOMOS on culture, heritage, and climate change in 2020 to assess the state of knowledge and practice in this domain and launch the preparation of an online international expert meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change to take place in December 2021, which will aim to further integrate culture in the global climate agenda and define a sustainable way forward. I'll come back to this initiative a little bit later. Since 2017, the World Heritage Center and the advisory bodies have been working on an updated policy document on World Heritage and climate change to take into account the latest knowledge in this regard. And I will come back to this also in a little bit. In April 2021, under the Italian presidency of the G20, UNESCO was also invited to chair one of the events of the G20 culture webinars addressing the climate crisis through culture, more specifically on strategies and actions for increased resilience of cultural heritage. The objective of the multi-stakeholder webinar with international experts was to identify common points for policy design and action for consideration by the G20 countries in the relevant fora, notably the G20 Culture Working Group and Ministerial. The flexible mechanism established at the initiative of Greece and endorsed by UNESCO, by the UNESCO Executive Board, is working to promote and accelerate the implementation of the practical actions and cooperation on addressing climate change impacts on cultural and natural heritage. Culture in the 2030 agenda has been also a very central commitment of UNESCO and the UN in general, but UNESCO in particular. UNESCO is committed to supporting its member states in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the New Urban Agenda, which provide an important opportunity to integrate culture and development policies and interventions, while the safeguarding and promotion of culture represents an end in itself. It also contributes directly to many of the Sustainable Development Goals, including those of sustainable cities, decent work and economic growth, reduced inequalities, the environment, promoting gender equality, and peaceful and inclusive societies. This publication can be accessed online at UNESCO or on the UNESCO website. UNESCO also developed the thematic indicators for culture in the 2030 Agenda. Over the last decade, UNESCO's advocacy for a culture-based approach to development has resulted in several United Nations General Assembly resolutions that acknowledge the role of culture as an enabler and a driver of sustainable development. This process culminated in the integration of culture in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted in 2015 by 193 countries of the UN General Assembly, launched on the 19th of November during the Forum of Ministers of Culture and distributed to more than 120 ministers of culture. And that's the 193 countries of the UNESCO General Conference. Culture is explicitly referenced in SDG 11.4 to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. But beyond target 11.4, culture contributes to development, both as a sector of activity and transversally across other sectors. The contribution of culture to sustainable development is also clearly recognized in other international frameworks, including the New Urban Agenda and the Recommendation on the Historic Urban Landscape. UNESCO's commitment to ensuring that the transformative power of culture in enabling sustainable development continues with the development of the thematic indicators for culture in the 2030 Agenda. The initiative is an innovative effort to establish a methodology for demonstrating culture's role and contribution to the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I mention it here particularly because there are 22 indicators in this set of thematic indicators, and one of these 22 indicators is specifically focused on climate change and resilience and consists of a qualitative checklist. UNESCO, the urban areas and cities are hotspots in the climate crisis. They have the responsibility to mitigate crises, including those related to climate change impacts. As research source suggests that 70% of the world's greenhouse gases are emitted in cities. In this context, the 2011 HUL recommendation, or the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation approach, provides a paradigm for heritage-based solutions for sustainable, inclusive, and resilient urban futures. Through implementation of the HUL approach, the management of historic urban areas improves, and recovery and reconstruction processes may take into consideration the culture and cultural heritage and the empowerment of people. Traditional knowledge that is available is related communities helps in the efforts to reduce the impacts of climate change and enhance social inclusion, ultimately contributing to the international development frameworks. Traditional building technologies and building materials also contribute to such efforts. Cities are also key players in environmental sustainability. It is in cities that innovations, research, and transformative initiatives are concentrated, where tomorrow's solutions are imagined and created. Through its network of nearly 200 creative cities, UNESCO is integrating climate resilience into municipal strategies to reduce the carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. In collaboration with the Group on Earth Observation, GEO, Secretariat, and the GEO Greek office, UNESCO World Heritage Center has also recently launched the Urban Heritage Climate Observatory as a geo-community activity that applies Earth observation tools to understand and document the impacts of climate change on World Heritage cities. The aim of the initiative is to place World Heritage properties in cities at the heart of local and national policies and actions for sustainable urban development and climate change by proposing local and practical solutions and mechanisms to assist states parties to implement actions in support of sustainable development, adaptation to climate change, and enhancing resilience and disaster risk reduction, integrated with conservation of urban heritage and, where feasible, relevant, and contribute toward prompting and promoting mitigation actions in World Heritage cities. On the 1st and 2nd of July 2021, the Copernicus Climate Change Service, C3S, hosted a workshop with key sectoral stakeholders to discuss climate change challenges for both cultural and natural heritage properties and data needs and potential solutions offered by the service. This workshop aimed to understand climate change related challenges of cultural and natural heritage community identify specific needs for climate data tools and services in order to meet these challenges, present the C3S service offering, demonstrate where it fits in the climate service value chain, and determine ways in which it would support the cultural and natural heritage community. On the 19th of November 2015, the 20th General Assembly of the States Parties to the World Heritage Convention adopted the policy on the integration of a sustainable development perspective into the processes of the World Heritage Convention as a guide to harness the potential of World Heritage properties and heritage in general to contribute to sustainable development and increase the effectiveness and relevance of the 1972 Convention. Therefore, when implementing the 1972 Convention, the states parties should consider the following key dimensions which reflect the concern for planet, people, prosperity, and peace, and important areas of the 2030 agenda. So the first dimension or area of concern is environmental sustainability. And it should be promoted to all World Heritage properties. It includes responsible interaction with the environment, avoiding depletion or degradation of natural resources, ensuring long-term environmental quality, and the strengthening of resilience to disasters and climate change. The second dimension is inclusive social development, enhancing quality of life and well-being in and around World Heritage properties is essential, taking into account communities who might not visit or reside in or near properties, but are still stakeholders. Their full inclusion, respect, and equity are a fundamental premise for this dimension. And this dimension includes also the indigenous peoples along with local communities. Inclusive economic development. World Heritage properties as cultural and natural heritage in general offer great potential to alleviate poverty and enhance sustainable livelihoods of local communities. The 1972 Convention should contribute to promoting sustainable forms of inclusive and equitable economic development, productive and decent employment and income-generating activities for all, while fully respecting the OUV of World Heritage properties. Fostering of peace and security is the fourth dimension. Sustainable development and the conservation of world's heritage are undermined by war, civil conflict, and all forms of violence, and the Convention is part of UNESCO's established mandate to build bridges towards peace and security. States parties should therefore acknowledge the reality of cultural diversity within and around World Heritage properties and promote a culturally pluralistic approach and strategies for their conservation and management. As part of the World Heritage Sustainable Tourism Program, the UNESCO World Heritage Center teamed up with UNEP and the Union of Concerned Scientists to publish a report on the World Heritage and tourism in a changing climate. This report provides an overview of the increasing vulnerability of World Heritage sites to climate change impacts and the potential implications for and of global tourism. It also examines the close relationship between World Heritage and tourism and how climate change is likely to exacerbate problems caused by unplanned tourism development and uncontrolled or poorly managed visitor access, as well as other threats and stresses. Tourism can also play a positive role in helping to secure the future of many World Heritage sites in a changing climate. In one of the recommendations, this report stresses the need to ensure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are fully involved at all stages of climate adaptation and tourism development, and that utilizing local and traditional knowledge systems for effective adaptation of World Heritage sites is vital in the face of climate change. The UNESCO-IPCC ICOMOS-IPCC co-sponsored International Expert Meeting on Culture, Heritage and Climate Change is something you might already be familiar with. Despite the growing impact of climate change on culture, as well as the fundamental relationship between culture and climate change mitigation and adaptation, culture is largely absent from the international climate agenda. For these reasons, and in order to support the critical integration of the role of culture into global climate action, both as a shared global asset that needs to be safeguarded from the effects of climate change and as a transversal resource for climate change mitigation and adaptation, UNESCO, the IPCC and ICOMOS have launched a joint initiative on culture, heritage, and climate change. As part of this initiative, a co-sponsored international expert meeting will be organized from the 6th to 10th December 2021 by UNESCO, the IPCC, and ICOMOS on the theme of culture, heritage, and climate change, bringing together representatives of scientific, cultural, and heritage agencies and bodies, as well as local communities, international organizations, key experts at national and local levels, non-governmental organizations and academics from around the world to assess the state of knowledge and practice linking culture and climate change and to devise a sustainable way forward. A set of 3 white papers to assess peer-reviewed scientific publications and knowledge gaps has been commissioned to several teams of international experts and is currently being prepared on the following themes. And they are seen as conversation starters. The role of culture and natural heritage for climate actions, solutions, for example, impacts, vulnerability, and understanding risks, intangible cultural heritage, diverse knowledge systems, and climate change knowledge. So the knowledge white paper will address several aspects: the nature and the scope of representation of diverse forms and scales of culture and heritage in climate literature and assessments, the integration of diverse knowledge systems, including indigenous knowledge systems, across areas of climate research and response. It also will highlight the climate change itself as a history, as do all communities, and will look into the nature and scope of historical, social, and cultural contexts of the Anthropocene. In addition, there are 2 cross-cutting issues related to cultural governance and capacity to learn from the past that will also be addressed at this December meeting. When it comes more specifically to World Heritage and climate change, a very important tool to consider is the policy document on the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties, and that was adopted first in 2007, and the revision of which is about to conclude during the next month at the General Assembly of States Parties. The first draft policy document on the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties was discussed at the 31st session of the World Heritage Committee in 2007. The views expressed by the committee were incorporated and revised, and the policy document was presented to the General Assembly at its 16th session in 2007, which adopted the policy document and strongly recommended the use by all concerned. Subsequently, at its 40th session in 2016, aware that knowledge related to adaptation and mitigation change had drastically increased over the last 10 years, the committee requested the World Heritage Center and the advisory bodies to periodically review and update the policy document to make it more current. As part of the updating process, an important desk review of all existing documentation was undertaken in 2019. In order to make this process as inclusive and participatory as possible, the World Heritage Center also launched a wide online consultation of all stakeholders of the convention, including states parties, site managers, local communities, and indigenous peoples representatives, academics, NGOs, civil society, and the advisory bodies to gather feedback and comments on this crucial matter. The outcome of the consultation, it was stressed that the major types of climate-related impacts experienced as a result of climate hazards on the World Heritage property related to increased cost of maintenance or management in nearly half of the responses collected in the survey, the direct damage to historic built fabric, the deterioration of the historic built fabric, as well as impact on tourism. Others commonly mentioned experiences and impacts refer to biodiversity, for example, the loss of species, on local communities or indigenous peoples, as well as on landscape changes, for example, the loss of the ability to grow traditional plants, agricultural systems, on the availability of water. A number of respondents also highlighted the degradation of the outstanding universal value of World Heritage properties and the loss of intangible heritage. As you can see on this slide, when asked about the elements to be prioritized as climate mitigation topics on the updated policy document, more than half of the respondents stressed the necessity to use traditional knowledge and heritage values or methodologies associated with World Heritage properties to communicate best practices in mitigation strategies to drive mitigation ambitions and also for adaptation actions to enhance resilience of local communities. Actually, 2 of the 3 first elements prioritized related to traditional knowledge and heritage values. When asked about the most relevant entities that should be most engaged to formulate and implement climate actions and priorities, over half of the respondents to the survey highlighted the importance of traditional knowledge and emphasized the critical need for community participation for adaptation and mitigation of the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties. The updated policy document was endorsed by the World Heritage Committee at its extended 44th session and will now be in July of 2021 and will now be transmitted for review and adoption by the 23rd session of the General Assembly of States Parties to the World Heritage Convention, which will take place next month. The policy document is an action-oriented document which sets a long-term vision to present the current and future potential impacts of climate change on the outstanding universal value of heritage properties and undertakes climate action in an effective, ambitious, cooperative, and active way, consistent with their obligations under the Convention. To assist states parties in reaching this vision, the policy document establishes a series of 4 climate heritage, climate action goals and provides details on elements for climate action dedicated to the 4 main topics of the global agenda: assessing climate risks, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, knowledge sharing, capacity building and awareness, as well as introducing the concept of transformative change. In Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement, the parties acknowledge that adaptation action should follow and should be based on and guided by the best available science as well as appropriate traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. It is recognized in the updated policy document that World Heritage properties should seek to exemplify this approach. The importance of indigenous peoples and local communities' knowledge for understanding the impacts of climate change and designing and implementing appropriate climate actions should be valued and valorized. The updated policy document highlights in several occasions the critical importance of traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge for an efficient climate action. I want to just end now by quickly going through a couple of examples of local actions, because a lot of what I have talked about are in the normative realm in terms of global policies, but also in terms of local actions. UNESCO has been engaged on these, and I just want to bring up a couple of instances and ways. For example, the Rapid Response Facility is something that helps to address emergencies at World Heritage sites. The emergency fund that provided grants to World Heritage sites and protected areas during sudden crises like wildfires. here we are a partnership on the flora and fauna of several foundations. The progress was made, for example, in the Pantanal Conservation Area in Brazil and the Sundarbans National Park. During the 43rd session of the World Heritage Convention, the Bujbim cultural landscape in Australia was inscribed on the World Heritage List, which is located in the traditional country of the Gunditjmara people in southeastern Australia. This property features a complex system of channels, weirs, and dams developed by the Gunditjmara people. At this same committee session, the writing on stone, the ICOMOS-IPCC site in Canada, was also inscribed on the World Heritage List. This property is sacred to the Blackfoot people. Their centuries-old traditions are perpetuated through ceremonies and in enduring respect for the places. With rising temperatures and accompanying sea level rise, an increasing risk of climate change-related disasters are also on the rise. With over 90% of all urban areas being coastal, it puts most cities on Earth at risk of flooding from rising sea levels and powerful storms. Historic cities are particularly at risk because many of them were developed for historical reasons along coasts or major rivers. There's a large number of World Heritage cities, nearly a third of them are along the coast. So climate change is now among the top threats to cultural natural heritage sites inscribed on the World Heritage List. And I bring this up especially because many of these cities have had traditional systems of coping with the particular site that they're located in, the larger geographical setting, and with traditional building practices. And these are very integral as part of the solution. I want to just touch upon the World Heritage Canopy, a platform of innovative practices and strategies that further heritage-based solutions for sustainable development that include also the implementation of the Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation. And you can find this on the World Heritage site mentioned at the bottom of the slide. The World Heritage, the Great Barrier Reef project, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it is pioneered by the Great Barrier Reef Foundation in partnership with UNESCO and a diverse range of international partners, and is building capacity and driving whole of community approach to challenges facing our treasured reefs, starting with 4 pilot World Heritage reefs in Australia, Belize, New Caledonia, and Palau. And of course, the local and indigenous knowledges are very important aspect of this as well. And I want to end now with this last example, where a wealth of knowledge, where there is already a lot of information on the and work that was done on the Kutamaku, the land of the Bata Mariba in Togo, for support and assistance, which is a cultural landscape. This has been, and as a cultural landscape, of course, includes also very much the indigenous people of the Bata Mariba. And so and their knowledge and practices in the management of this cultural landscape is, of course, very, very central. The World Heritage Center is presently contributing into the framework of an intersectoral and interdisciplinary approach to the Global Action Plan of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, adopted, which is 2022-2023, that was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2019. With regular consultations with the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage, the IIFPFWH, have taken place during the period concerned on conservation and management matters, the impact and challenges related to COVID-19 crisis, as well as the possible ways to better monitor the presence and involvement of Indigenous peoples in World Heritage properties. with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hosagrahar. You did a wonderful job of going into the extensive and detailed work that the World Heritage Center and UNESCO are pursuing in furtherance of our main topic here, which is climate change and world heritage. So thank you very much for that. I'm looking at the chat and at the Q&A to see if we have some questions, but I have one. You mentioned numerous times in the various reports the role of indigenous people and traditional knowledge, which is critical from our point of view as well. And we have speakers later today from Canada and from Australia that will touch on that. I'm wondering if you have any other sites in mind that come to mind around the world in World Heritage Centers where indigenous people are already actively engaged in management or cooperative management of those World Heritage sites. Both Australia and Canada have done so. We have not yet in the US, but we are moving in that direction. And I'm still looking for other models.
Yes, indeed. There are several natural heritage sites and mixed sites where this is happening. Where the indigenous, and again, I think we have to be careful in how we talk about indigenous peoples and local communities, because in many cases they are people who have lived there for centuries and so are the first peoples of those regions. And so, I'm thinking, for instance, of course, you have the people in the Okavango area, the Chad region, as well as in the Virunga National Park. There are all these sort of areas where they're very key. But there are also practices, whether we are looking at the Dogon housing in Africa, we have a number of different examples of the Dogon people. We have the Jene, there are many different examples like this. But I'm also thinking in terms of the Lhasa, in Lhasa they have practices based on traditional practices of different types. And so I think there's a number of places where you can find traditional communities that have traditional, like as I said, it's inherited knowledges of building practices that are very, very key as well.
Thank you for that. I don't see any questions popping up. And I know it's getting late, a late hour in Paris. So I think we'll thank you again very much for your presentation and let you get on with your evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for this interest, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of the conference. Thank you.